I had always wanted a place that felt like it was mine and nobody else's. Somewhere remote, with trees on every side and no road noise. Somewhere I could walk out in the morning and hear nothing but birds and wind. It took me years to find it, but when I finally signed the paperwork on the cabin in northern Minnesota, it felt like something I'd worked toward my whole life was finally real. It wasn't huge. 2 rooms, kitchen and bedroom, no electricity, with stove for heat, a pump well nearby for water, no cell service, no one around for miles. The seller had mentioned that the nearest cabin was over 3 miles away, beyond a thick stretch of woods and bog. I didn't see the need to check. The remoteness was part of the charm. My girlfriend Amy had been unsure at first, but she warmed up to it over time. I think the first weekend we stayed there, she was uneasy, probably the way the place creaked at night or how pitch black it got after sundown. But by the 3rd trip out there, she was the one packing the truck before I even got home from work. We'd started using the cabin every other weekend once spring hit. It became our place even though technically it was mine. That weekend started like any other. We got to the cabin Friday evening, just before dusk. The air was still cool that early in the season, but the snow had fully melted and the ground had a soft give to it. We'd stopped in town for firewood, eggs, and a few canned things. Mostly we just wanted to hike and sleep in and drink coffee on the porch. Saturday morning we woke up with the sun. We ate quietly, read for a bit, then decided to hike deeper into the woods. I had a rough idea of where things were: a small lake to the north, marshland to the east, and the high ridge to the south that marked the edge of the old logging trail. We'd gone north and east before, but this time I suggested heading west, just to see what was out there. We followed a deer trail through the trees for maybe an hour. Amy kept stopping to take pictures of moss and bark. I liked that she noticed the small things. The land sloped downward the farther we went. The trees got denser, but then we hit a clearing. That's when we saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the moment we stepped out of the trees, there was no denying it. A cabin. A single-story wooden cabin, sitting on a rise just like ours. Even from a distance, it looked familiar. We walked closer. It wasn't until I saw the bent porch railing and the rusted bucket hanging on the same nail that it sank in. It looked exactly like our cabin. Not just a similar layout. It looked identical. The same number of windows, same kind of logs, the same little steps made of flat stones leading to the door. Even the firewood stack had the same notch pattern on the logs. Amy stood next to me, quiet. I didn't say anything either. I just kept walking. We stepped onto the porch. I could hear birds in the trees again, but they sounded further off now. I reached for the door handle, half expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. It opened with the same soft creak as ours did. Inside, the light came in dimly through the side windows. Dust hung in the air, floating in thick beams of sunlight. It was like stepping into a photograph of our place. Same table, same 2 chairs, same little dent in the wood floor near the stove. Even the chipped coffee mug on the counter was the same. Amy picked it up, turning it in her hand. In the bedroom, the mattress was made up with the same green sleeping bag we used. The oil lantern on the windowsill had the same smudges on the glass. There was even a pair of our old hiking boots in the corner. Same brand, same color, same worn soles. I touched the wall, felt solid, real. I moved slowly, listening. There was no sound in the place. No sign of anyone having been there. No food smell. No dishes in the sink. Just dust. Heavy, thick dust on the floor and on top of the stove. The kind that takes a long time to settle. We didn't talk about it until we got back. Neither of us wanted to walk home through the woods after what we'd seen, but staying in that other cabin didn't feel like an option either, so we headed back toward ours. The walk back felt longer. I kept checking behind us. Amy kept glancing to the side, as if expecting something to show up between the trees. By the time we reached our place, the sun had shifted. Everything looked just a little more gray. The air smelled sharper, like a storm might be brewing. We both checked the outside of our cabin before going in. Everything was where we left it. Even the inside was unchanged. Firewood stacked neatly, mugs still clean by the sink, backpack on the hook by the door. Still, we didn't feel right. We didn't eat much that night. We went to bed early, and neither of us slept. Every creak outside had me holding my breath. Amy clutched her sleeping bag tighter every time the wind picked up. I must have dozed off eventually, but when I woke up, it was barely light and she was already sitting up, dressed and ready to go. We packed up fast. Didn't even make coffee. We got back to the truck in silence and drove the whole 3 hours home without turning on the radio. That would have been the end of it. Just a weird fluke, a freak copy of our cabin someone must have built nearby for some unknown reason. Except I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next weekend, I went back alone. Amy didn't want to come, and I didn't blame her. I told her I just wanted to clear my head. She looked at me like she already knew that wasn't why I was going. I got there before noon. The air was still. No animals. Not even squirrels in the trees. I went into our cabin first. Checked every drawer, every corner. Everything was normal. Then I grabbed my pack, turned on my GPS, and headed west. It was harder to find this time. I followed the same trail I thought we'd taken, but the trees looked different now. I walked in circles for nearly an hour before I spotted a familiar notch in a tree trunk and followed it through a thicket of pines. And then, just like before, I stepped into the clearing. But this time, the cabin looked wrong. Same shape, same design, but it looked newer. The wood was cleaner. The porch was freshly swept. The firewood was neatly stacked. No mold, no rot. The windows were clean. It was like someone had been there just hours before. I walked up to the door. It was closed. I opened it. The inside smelled like pine and dust. There was no sign of anyone. But this time, no dust on the stove. The chairs had been moved slightly. One was angled toward the door. The sleeping bag in the back was unrolled. I checked the corner, no boots this time, just bare wood. But the floor was warm, not hot, just not cold. I backed out slowly and left the door open. Then I turned and walked away fast. I didn't go back to my own cabin. I got in the truck and left, drove straight home. I kept trying to convince myself it was a squatter. Maybe someone had copied the build. Maybe there were old plans online. But even then, why make it identical down to the color of the door hinges? Why furnish it exactly the same? Why was it abandoned the first time and lived in the second? Amy and I didn't talk about it. I didn't mention going back. I pretended it hadn't happened. But a few weeks later, I got an email from the county. There'd been a permit renewal notice for a property in my area. The funny thing was, they said it had been flagged because of duplication, 2 registered properties within the same GPS square, both with identical descriptions, same square footage, same building materials. They asked if I knew anything about a second structure matching mine in the area. I didn't respond. Instead, I sold the cabin. I didn't visit again. I left everything behind: gear, furniture, even food in the cabinets. I didn't want to pack anything. I didn't want anything that might have come from that other place or might have been confused between the two. I live in the city now. I still hike, but only day trips. I never stay overnight. I keep thinking about that second cabin, though. About the warm floor, the missing boots, the clean windows. I wonder if someone's still there. I wonder if they're still updating it to match mine. Or maybe I was the copy, and maybe they're wondering why I left. I don't really know what made me think about that weekend again. Maybe it was the smell of wet wood when I passed by a construction site, or maybe it was just the silence in my apartment that morning that pulled my memory back to that cabin in the woods. It's been a few years, but the details are still fresh. Some things you just don't forget. And even though we all made it back, something about what happened there has stuck with me in a way I can't really shake off. It was a trip that started like any other. 4 of us, me, Kevin, Sam, and Matt, had planned a long weekend at a remote cabin one of Kevin's cousins used to own. He'd inherited it after the guy passed away, and none of us had ever been there before. Kevin warned us it was old and probably dusty, maybe even in need of repairs, but we didn't care. We wanted somewhere quiet, away from everything. A place with no cell service, no traffic, no responsibilities. Just beer, food, and time to breathe. We drove up on a Thursday afternoon. The last hour of the drive was nothing but winding gravel roads cutting through dense pine forest. GPS had cut out well before then, and we had to rely on printed directions and a hand-drawn map Kevin brought. When we finally pulled up to the place, it looked just like you'd expect. Weathered with siding, a rusty metal roof, and a sagging porch that looked like it might fall off if you stepped on the wrong board. There were cobwebs in the corners and a layer of leaves and dirt on the steps, but the front door opened easy enough, and the inside, while dusty, was livable. It had 2 small bedrooms, an open kitchen, and a narrow living room with a wood-burning stove. No TV, no Wi-Fi, but the lights worked when we turned the power on at the fuse box out back. It wasn't fancy, but it felt solid. The kind of place where people used to spend weeks at a time hunting or fishing. The air smelled like dust, pine, and old firewood. We unpacked, claimed rooms, and cracked open our first beers by 5. The plan was simple: hang out, explore a little, maybe hike during the day and chill around the fire at night. That first evening was uneventful, except for the moment we noticed the basement door. It was in the kitchen just beside the pantry. We hadn't seen it right away. It looked more like a closet door, painted the same color as the wall and without a visible handle. Sam spotted it when he leaned against the wall and felt it move slightly. When we looked closer, we realized it had an old keyhole under a rusty plate, but no knob or latch. It was locked, solid. Even with a shoulder check, it didn't budge. Kevin said he didn't remember anything about a basement, but we figured it made sense. Cabins like that usually had root cellars or places to store tools and firewood in winter. We joked about what might be down there. Old taxidermy, buried treasure, maybe some creepy furniture or forgotten hunting gear. Sam tried using a pocket knife to pick the lock, but it didn't work. The key, if it still existed, was nowhere in sight. We gave up after 10 minutes and went back to drinking. That night passed quietly. The wind rattled the trees and we heard something scurry on the roof, probably a raccoon or squirrel. The cabin creaked like any old wooden structure would, but nothing unusual. The next morning, we went for a hike down to a stream Kevin remembered seeing on the map. It was a solid 2-hour walk both ways, and by the time we got back, we were starving. We grilled some burgers on the fire pit out back and sat under the fading sky until the stars came out. It was the 3rd night when things started to feel off, subtle at first. I was walking through the kitchen to grab another beer when I noticed the basement door again. This time, it looked slightly different. The panel that covered the keyhole, it was tilted, like it had been shifted or jostled. I bent down to look closer and saw that it was hanging a bit loose on one side. I called the others in to check, and sure enough, something had moved it. But the door was still shut and still locked. None of us had touched it since that first night, and we'd all been together since. There was no reason for it to change. Still, we figured maybe it had been that way all along and we just hadn't noticed. We brushed it off, even joked about it again. But I remember feeling a little colder in the kitchen that night. Maybe it was just the draft from the window. The next day was colder, cloudy. We stayed in most of the morning, then took a drive out to a general store an hour away to restock on food and beer. By the time we got back, the sky was already darkening and the wind had picked up. A storm was rolling in. We cooked inside that night and settled in the living room to play cards and drink. It was one of those nights that felt like it dragged on, like time moved slower in that cabin. I don't know what made me get up around 2 in the morning. Maybe the wind, maybe something else. I remember lying in bed, half asleep, listening to the branches scrape against the windows, and then a soft noise, like wood shifting, not creaking, more like a door moving. I got up and stepped into the hallway. The rest of the cabin was silent, but that noise had definitely come from inside. I walked toward the kitchen. The only light came from the small battery-powered lantern we left on the counter. The basement door was open, wide open. The air coming up from below was colder than the rest of the house. It smelled damp, like earth and old wood. I stood there for a long time, not moving. My body was tense all over. It was that kind of moment where your brain hasn't caught up to what your eyes are seeing. I finally stepped forward and looked down. The stairs were old and narrow, leading into complete darkness. No sound, no movement, just black. I woke the others. We stood at the top of the stairs for a while, trying to figure out what to do. We didn't have any big flashlights, just a few headlamps and one of those cheap handheld ones that flickers if you shake it too hard. Kevin led the way and I followed. The basement was empty, just dirt floor, wooden walls, and old support beams. A few crates in the corners, some broken tools, and a pile of firewood that looked like it had been untouched for years. No sign of recent activity. No animals, no furniture, no hidden rooms, nothing. But the weirdest thing was the door itself. When we looked at it from the inside, we noticed fresh scrape marks around the edges, like something had been forced open. There were small wood splinters on the floor, and the latch plate was bent outward, subtle but recent. None of us said it, but we all felt it. Someone or something had opened it. But who? There were no signs of break-in upstairs. All the windows and doors were locked. No tracks outside in the dirt, even near the back of the cabin. We didn't sleep well that night. Every sound made us flinch. The wind didn't let up until dawn. By the time morning came, we were all on edge. Kevin wanted to leave, but the rest of us voted to stay one more night. Maybe out of stubbornness, maybe out of pride. We tried to go about the day normally, but it was different. The air in the cabin felt heavier. We stuck together. No one wanted to be alone. That night, we barricaded the basement door with a heavy dresser and stacked chairs on top. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it made us feel better. We took turns staying up in shifts just in case. Around 4 a.m., I was on watch when I heard a soft thump. It came from the kitchen. When I got there, everything was still in place except one thing. The door was shut again, still locked, still solid, but the dresser had moved a few inches. The chairs were tilted, like they'd been pushed from the other side. I stood there, staring at it, breathing slow, heart pounding. I didn't open it. I didn't touch anything. I just stood there until the sun came up. We left the next morning, packed up as fast as we could, cleaned up the trash, locked the cabin, and drove away. No one said much on the drive home. It wasn't until a few weeks later that Kevin called and told me something strange. He'd gone back to the cabin alone to check on things. The door was wide open again. This time, there were footprints on the basement floor. Bare footprints, small, like a child's. There's no real explanation for what happened. We never figured it out. Maybe someone was living under there. Maybe someone used that place for something before Kevin inherited it. Maybe it was just some old squatter who found a way in through a tunnel or a trapdoor we didn't see. But nothing about that place made sense. We didn't tell many people about it. The few we did told us it was probably just wildlife or paranoia. But we know what we saw. We know what we felt. Something was in that basement. And whatever it was, it never really left. It just waited, quiet, watching. And when it was ready, it opened the door. The drive to the cabin was long and lonely. It's tucked deep into the forest, miles away from the nearest town. A place I'd rented for a week to get away from everything. Work stress, noise, and people. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. The silence, the fresh air, the simple peace of the woods. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. I arrived just before dusk, the fading sun casting long shadows through the trees. The gravel road was rough, with potholes and loose stones, making the ride bumpy. When I finally reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, the site was exactly what I'd hoped for. An old, weathered wooden cabin, with a stone chimney and a porch cluttered with firewood and a rusty rocking chair. I parked my truck and stepped out, feeling the sudden drop in temperature. The forest was quiet except for the occasional call of a distant bird and the soft rustling of leaves in the light breeze. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I took a deep breath and grabbed my bag. The cabin's door creaked as I opened it, revealing a small living room with worn furniture, a wood stove, and a simple kitchen. It wasn't fancy, but it was comfortable. That first night was peaceful. I made a fire, cooked a simple dinner, and sat by the window watching the stars come out one by one. The quiet was exactly what I needed. But as the hours passed, I started to notice little things that made me uneasy. A faint knocking sound came from outside. At first, I thought it was the wind pushing a loose branch against the cabin. But the knocking continued, slow and rhythmic, almost deliberate. I stood up, looked through the window, but all I could see was darkness and the outline of trees. I shrugged it off and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. Every creak and snap outside made me tense. I kept thinking I saw movement at the edge of the clearing, shadows shifting, but each time I looked, there was nothing. The next morning, I stepped outside to gather firewood and clear the porch. As I moved through the clearing, I noticed footprints in the soft mud near the cabin. They were large and irregular, like heavy boots, but the prints were too close to the cabin to be from any visitor who would have called ahead. I couldn't imagine who would be wandering this far out, unannounced. That afternoon, while exploring the nearby woods, I caught sight of a man. He was standing just at the edge of the tree line, watching me. His clothes were old and dirty, like he'd been living rough for a long time. His hair was long and tangled, his face covered with a thick, unkempt beard. He didn't move or speak, just stood there, staring. I froze, watching him. There was something off about the way he held himself. Too still, too quiet. The man's eyes, when they met mine, were cold and blank, like they didn't recognize me or didn't care. I slowly backed away and returned to the cabin as quickly as I could. That night, the knocking started again. This time it was louder, more forceful. It sounded like something heavy banging against the wood. I stayed near the door, knife in hand, heart pounding. The noise stopped after a few minutes, and I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. The following day, I found more signs that someone had been close by. My firewood pile had been disturbed. Some logs knocked over, bits of dirt scattered around. A few fresh footprints near the back of the cabin. It was clear someone had been lurking near my shelter. I didn't want to believe it was the man I'd seen, but there was no one else around. I was alone in the woods with a stranger whose presence felt wrong. I tried to stay calm and rational. Maybe he was homeless, maybe lost, maybe harmless. But my gut said otherwise. That evening, as I sat inside, I heard footsteps circling the cabin. Heavy, slow steps, crunching leaves and breaking twigs. I peered out the window but saw nothing except darkness. The fire's glow barely reached beyond the clearing. Suddenly, a shadow moved past the window. Too fast, too quiet to be a deer or a raccoon. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The cold night air hit my face. The beam scanned the trees, but the man was gone. I felt a chill run down my spine. The next morning, I found a strange symbol scratched into the cabin's wooden porch near the door. It looked like a circle with lines crossing it, roughly carved. Not natural. Someone had been close enough to do it. I didn't know what to think. Was he some kind of vandal, or something worse? Over the following days, the man appeared more often, always at the edge of the woods, watching silently. His expression never changed. Sometimes I saw him sitting on a fallen log, staring into the distance. He never approached the cabin during daylight, but as night fell, I was sure he came closer. One night, the knocking turned into pounding. The door shook violently. I stood frozen, listening as the sounds grew louder. Something was trying to get inside. I grabbed the heavy chair and wedged it against the door, heart racing. The pounding stopped as suddenly as it started. I waited for hours, clutching my knife, too scared to sleep. Morning came with relief, but I knew I couldn't stay much longer. That day, I packed my things, deciding to leave at first light. The forest had lost its peace. Something about that man, his presence, the signs of him around the cabin, had stolen the calm from this place. I drove out before dawn, eyes scanning the tree line. I didn't see him that morning, but I knew he was still out there, somewhere in those woods. Driving back toward civilization, I realized how vulnerable I had felt. Alone, watched, hunted by someone I couldn't understand. The weird man wasn't a ghost or some legend. He was real, human but dangerous, and no matter how far I go, the feeling of being watched follows me. The sun was just setting as I pulled up to the cabin, a tiny wooden structure deep in the woods where I hoped to spend a few quiet days alone. I was tired of city noise, the endless distractions, and I needed a break. The place was remote, far from the nearest town, tucked away in a dense forest of firs and maples. I had been here once before, a couple of years back, but this time, something already felt off. I stepped out of my truck, the air cold and sharp, smelling of pine and wet earth. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the trees stretched tall and close, their branches creaking as a chill wind whispered through them. The cabin looked just like I remembered, simple with a stone chimney and a small porch. I stacked some wood near the door and got the fire going inside. The crackle and warmth of the flames felt good, and for a while, I let myself relax. As the night deepened, I sat by the fire and looked out the window. The woods around the cabin were alive with the usual sounds. Distant owls, the occasional snap of a twig, leaves rustling in the wind. But then I noticed something else. A pair of glowing eyes reflecting faintly in the darkness, not far from the edge of the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The beam cut through the blackness and landed on a deer standing quietly among the trees. Its eyes shone bright in the light, but something was wrong. The deer wasn't acting like any animal I'd ever seen. It stood completely still, unnervingly silent, watching me with a gaze that felt too steady, almost deliberate. The creature's body was thin, too thin for a healthy deer, and its fur looked patchy and dull, hanging loosely over bones that seemed sharper than they should be. The deer's legs were oddly stiff, its movements stiff and unnatural when it shifted slightly. I knew animals could look strange sometimes, especially in the wild, but this was different. For the next few days, the deer, or maybe it was more than one, came back again and again. Sometimes they were just outside the cabin, standing in the shadows, watching. Other times, I'd catch glimpses of them deeper in the woods, moving silently among the trees. They never ran off like normal deer would. They just stood there, staring. One evening, after a long day of hiking, I returned to the cabin to find strange markings carved into the bark of a tree near the porch. They looked like scratches but oddly patterned, almost deliberate. I tried to shake the unease, telling myself it was probably just some local hunters or vandals. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The nights grew colder, and the presence of the deer became more unsettling. Their eyes would catch the firelight through the windows, and I sometimes heard soft, eerie sounds, like a mix between a low growl and a whimper. It wasn't a sound deer normally made, and it raised the hairs on the back of my neck. One night, I woke suddenly to the sound of heavy breathing just outside the cabin. My heart thudding, I shone the flashlight out the window. Standing right there in the clearing was one of those deer, unnervingly close, its eyes fixed on the cabin like it was waiting for something. Then I noticed the deer's mouth was slightly open, showing sharp teeth that I didn't expect. Teeth that looked more like a predator's than a deer's. It was breathing heavily, its flanks rising and falling fast. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. The animal wasn't normal. It was sick, or worse, something else entirely. But what? I had never seen anything like it before. Over the next few days, the deer grew bolder. They circled the cabin, moved in the shadows, sometimes even scratching at the wooden walls with their hooves. At one point, I found deep gouges in the door frame, as if something tried to force its way inside. I stayed alert, keeping the fire going day and night. I was constantly checking the windows and doors, feeling more trapped with every passing hour. I stopped going far from the cabin, afraid to leave my only shelter. One afternoon, I went out to gather more firewood and found something that chilled me to the bone. A pile of bones, bleached white, half buried in the dirt under a fallen tree. The bones looked like small animal remains at first, but then I spotted pieces that were definitely human. Fingertips, a cracked skull fragment, shards of torn fabric. The realization hit me hard. Whatever these creatures were, they had been around longer than I thought. They were dangerous, possibly predatory, and I had no way of calling for help out here. That night, the sounds outside the cabin got louder. Scraping, knocking, heavy footsteps. I stayed huddled near the fire, clutching my knife and a heavy stick. Suddenly, the door shook violently. Something was trying to get in. My breath caught, I swung the door open with all my strength, flashlight in hand, and found myself face to face with one of the creepy deer. It stood unnaturally tall, its legs locked rigid, eyes glowing bright in the beam. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I saw the wildness, the pain, and the hunger in its eyes. Then, with a sudden rush, it lunged forward, knocking me back into the cabin. I slammed the door and barricaded it with a heavy chair, heart pounding, sweat pouring down my face. The deer didn't leave, stayed outside, pacing, breathing heavily, making low snarls. The night felt endless. I knew I couldn't stay there much longer. At first light, I packed what I could carry, doused the fire, and left the cabin behind. I moved as fast as I could through the woods, without looking back. The forest was no longer a place of peace for me. It had changed. Something dark and wrong had taken hold. Those deer were not just animals. They were predators, transformed or sick in ways I couldn't understand. I never returned to that cabin. Now, when I hear about strange animal behavior or eerie forest sightings, I remember those eyes watching me in the dark, the hollow, stiff movements, the feeling of being hunted by something familiar but terrifying. And I know that some parts of the woods are better left alone. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the tall pine trees when I arrived at the cabin. The air was crisp and smelled like earth and pine needles. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone in the woods, away from the noise of the city and the endless demands of work. The cabin was small but sturdy, made of weathered logs with a stone chimney and a porch that creaked beneath my boots. It was perfect. The drive had been long and lonely, a winding gravel road that disappeared into the dense forest. I passed only one other car on the way in, a pickup truck that vanished down a side trail. Other than that, nothing but trees and silence. That silence was what I'd wanted most. Just the sounds of the forest, birds, the wind through the leaves, maybe the distant call of a loon. I set my things down and took a slow walk around the cabin. The sun had almost set, and the shadows stretched long across the forest floor. I stacked some firewood, made sure the stove was working, and prepared a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers. After eating, I sat by the window watching the sky darken and the stars begin to appear. The woods were peaceful, too peaceful maybe, but I liked it that way. I didn't expect anything strange to happen, but strange did happen. The first sign that something was off came the second night. I was lying in bed when I heard a soft knock on the door. It was faint but deliberate, 3 slow, steady knocks. I froze, listening. The knocking stopped. I told myself it must be an animal, maybe a branch hitting the door in the wind. But the air outside was still. The next morning, I found footprints near the cabin. Large, heavy prints that didn't look like any animal I knew. They were too big for a deer or a bear, and the shape was odd, almost human but not quite. The prints circled the cabin, coming close enough to touch the walls but never stepping onto the porch. I felt a chill but didn't say anything. Maybe I was imagining things. Later that day, while gathering firewood, I spotted a man in the distance. He stood just beyond the tree line, watching me. At first, I thought it was a hiker or a hunter, but as I looked closer, something felt wrong. His clothes were old and dirty, hanging loose on his thin frame. His hair was matted and unkempt, and his face, well, it was hard to see clearly, but the shape was strange. Uneven eyes, a crooked mouth, a nose that looked broken long ago. He wasn't threatening, but he didn't look right. There was something off about him. I didn't approach. He didn't move or wave, just stood there, staring with those weird, uneven eyes. After a few moments, he disappeared into the trees. That night, the knocking returned, this time louder, more insistent. It wasn't just the door anymore. I heard knocks on the windows, thumps against the walls. I stayed inside, heart pounding, clutching a heavy flashlight. I scanned the darkness outside but saw nothing. The next day, more strange things happened. My firewood pile had been disturbed. Logs shifted, some broken. Tracks circled closer to the cabin. The man was back. I caught glimpses of him watching from the woods, sometimes sitting on a fallen tree, sometimes just standing in the shadows. I didn't tell anyone about it. There was no cell service, and even if there were, who would believe me? A weird-looking man lurking in the woods? Felt like something from a bad movie. The nights grew worse. The noises outside became louder and more frequent. Knocks, scraping sounds, heavy footsteps that circled the cabin. One night, I woke to the sound of someone, or something, breathing heavily just outside the window. I turned on the flashlight and caught a glimpse of him. That strange man, his head tilted, watching me with those unsettling eyes. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The following day, I decided I needed to leave. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking. As I loaded the truck, I saw him again, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching. This time, he stepped forward into the fading light. His face was even more disturbing up close. Skin pale and blotchy, scars crossing his cheeks, a crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes. I climbed into the truck and started the engine, my eyes fixed on him as I backed down the gravel road. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching until I was out of sight. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway and the safety of towns and people. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the memory of those eyes and that crooked smile. The woods aren't as peaceful as I thought, and somewhere out there, that weird man is still watching.